All right, we're getting close to 3 o'clock here. A little bit smaller group so far from last time. This was the best time for folks overall. So we'll see if others trickle in after 3 o'clock rolls around here. But I'll start out and welcome and thank everyone for joining today's meeting of the Monadnock Broadband Group. The group is an informal coalition of municipal officials, practitioners, and other stakeholders with an interest in understanding and coordinating relative to broadband issues, of course, in Southwest New Hampshire. My name's Henry Underwood, and I'm a planner at Southwest Region Planning Commission in Keene. And we won't do complete introductions today, even though we're a little light on attendance, and many of you know each other. So instead, I encourage you to introduce yourselves via the chat and greet each other that way. I do, however, want to briefly acknowledge and thank Tammy St. Gelay, Executive Director at the New Hampshire Bond Bank, for joining today. There were a couple of lines of discussion that came up last time, particularly items 2 and 10 in the attachment to your agenda, and will definitely benefit from her expertise there and maybe elsewhere. And by the way, if you might remember, Tammy last joined MBG meeting back in December of 2019. And so if you're looking for an introduction about the bond bank and what they do, is a great recording and slide deck there for you at our broadband planning webpage. So thanks, Tammy, for making some time today. Let's see, I sort of reserved up to 2 hours for today's meeting, if people find that helpful. We did get through a lot of the discussion topics in 2 hours last time, so perhaps we don't need that time, which is fine, but I'm available, and so is this Zoom meeting space, at least until 5. A couple of Zoom tips that I forgot last time. I think most of you are familiar with them. You can provide feedback during the meeting, thumbs up, thumbs down, raising your hands via the participants button. In that bar with the participants button is also how you access the chat, if you haven't found that yet. And I don't see anyone joining just by phone, but for anyone joining by phone, you can use *6 to mute yourself and unmute, and *9 to raise your hand. And I have a limited view of everyone's video, but you're welcome to try to get my attention that way, or hold up your hand that way too. Do my best to keep an eye on that. All right. So the purpose of today's meeting, it's tied to kind of where we are in the calendar year to some extent. Many communities in our region, I think it's around 12, and a smaller number outside of our region, have broadband infrastructure bonds passed or being considered this year. And one of the next steps beyond that, that town or authorization is working on an agreement with an internet service provider. And a lot of people were kind of asking similar questions, wondering about similar things. So we threw out the idea of kind of a working meeting so that we could kind of ask them all in the same place, share knowledge, things like that. So this is kind of a work session for the most part, just on those agreements. And I think most of you are joining from the broadband infrastructure bond perspective, but this likely also applies to other arrangements between a town and an internet service provider to some extent. Let's see. I see there's quite a few new attendees from last time, which is great. So in our previous meeting, the group developed and prioritized about a dozen concerns in the form of a short sentence or two that somehow relate to the town's role in these broadband infrastructure projects, the negotiations between the town government and the ISP. And we were able to discuss most, but not all of them. And to some extent, I think the group had more questions than answers on some of the topics. So in this meeting, we want to go back and make sure we cover well the topics that are going to take the most advantage of Tammy's expertise. Then we'll go on probably to the topics we didn't get to at all. And I think from there, we'll see what time is left to go back and look at the other ones. So that's the gist of things. And just so, again, the new folks are clear as to my role and the Planning Commission's role. We're here as facilitators for the meeting, not experts in the negotiation and the legal aspects of what you're doing. And this is really an open discussion. So we want, the goal is to have everyone participate, and want to let you know up front that this is not going to be a replacement for town council and your other expertise that you brought in, like bond counsel. Okay, great. What have I missed off my remarks? I'll take notes while we're talking and keep those updated so you can look back to them next time. So that's the brief introduction to the meeting. I did put, you'll notice, kind of a smaller agenda item before that work session, just to mix things up a little bit. It does relate to these bond-funded projects. And if you look on your agenda, I mentioned SB 85, and I mentioned, oh, excuse me, I'll have to go to my slide, switch windows here, and the American Rescue Plan Act. So I just want to briefly introduce those two items for those of you who haven't heard of them, and then actually turn to you for like any questions or updates you might have about these two things. But they're on here because they both are major funding opportunities for broadband. They're passed into law or on their way, and things are going to be happening with them this year potentially. So first, we'll talk about the American Rescue Plan, which was signed by the president earlier this month, and it allocates about $194 million just to New Hampshire towns, according to estimates from the New Hampshire Municipal Association, and out of a total of $1.5 billion, I believe, to the state overall. And generally, can be applied to things through the end of the 2024 calendar year. And you'll see in the bulleted list some of the things talk about infrastructure, including broadband infrastructure. So this is, a major piece of legislation that will play some role in broadband. This is listing what's eligible. The other part that I wanted to bring to your attention is the timing. This is a little bit fine print for you probably, but basically, as I've read from the New Hampshire Municipal Association, there's some dates known about when this is distributed to states. And, again, signed into law on March 11th, there's 60 days for that to be distributed to states. And there's maybe a little uncertainty about the timing for local governments receiving that. What's described as non-entitlement units of local government, that's most of you guys, that's towns, non-metro area towns and cities. So half of it is coming in that time frame to the state, and then there's again, there's a second half, not sooner than 12 months later than the first distribution. So realize that's a mouthful. Maybe before I mention the state item I wanted to talk about, are there any questions or updates people would like to share with respect to this? Okay.
I will be talking, Henry, a little bit about this and with the pooled issue that we have and how to affect that.
Okay. Do you want to cover that when we get into the bond related questions on the list? Okay. Anyway, this is an item to watch, and I think you can bet that we would, there'll be more news obviously about this, and we would share that with the group when it's available. But this is what I know so far, and you can go to the NHMA webpage to read a bit more. Okay. The second item I mentioned on the agenda is state law proposed this session. SB 85 would establish a matching grant initiative, and which would basically be a 50-50 distribution between the state fund and a combination of an ISP and a local government. So far, it's been voted on by the Senate and passed unanimously. It's in a House committee right now. But this is proposed this session, and if passed, would go into effect, I think July 1 of this year. There's some more information about this at SWRPC's page. And there were a couple things I wanted to highlight that I thought would be kind of applicable or related to, towns with broadband infrastructure bonds. For one, in this 4C38, it mentions that projects under construction are not eligible for this funding, but projects in planning stages are eligible. So that's, I don't think they go into a lot of definition there, but that's depending on when the program's announced, could rule out folks planning a bond sale this year from participating. I think that's kind of unclear now. The second item I mentioned is that bonds can be used as part of that 50% local match, the non-state match portion. Let's see. Okay, don't have a page 2 there, but the last thing I wanted to mention was when it would go into effect, and I believe that's July 1st. So just wanted to put this on your radar. Are there questions or updates anyone wants to share about this grant, proposed grant?
Yes, Henry. Doug Batchelder here from Troy Broadband Committee. So in SB 85, there presently is no definition of under construction. Does that mean active construction, or you've entered into a contract, or is that to be determined?
It's a good question, Doug. I don't know off the top of my head. Can anyone else answer the question for Doug?
Well, it sounds like the same language they used last year with those CARES Act grants that they gave out, and that if you had a contract, you weren't eligible. And, it kind of sounds like if you, like Greenfield, haven't actually had town meeting yet, that maybe you ought to be telling town meeting to vote down your bond so that you can get this money. It's just, this is punishing people who are doing the right thing. This is stupid, in my humble opinion.
So I think there's definitely a timing. There's a lot of questions in the air about this, and to be clear, I'm not suggesting anyone change their strategy. Part of these meetings is that there are folks who are thinking about this next year, and what approach they might take.
And maybe the thing to do is to find out, who the bill sponsors were here, and have a sidebar conversation with them and say, what about, we need a definition of under construction. And if you've got an approved bond, but you haven't signed a contract yet, does that mean you're not under construction? And, to the point that was just made by Tom, if there could be something grandfathered for those that have been doing the right thing so far in trying to move things forward for their people, then maybe there could be some kind of an amendment made as it's in the committee. If it's in the committee in the House right now, it might be a chance to do that and then do a bill reconciliation.
That's a good suggestion, and I'm happy to reach out to one of the bill sponsors. Christine, did you have a comment?
Yes, it's along the same lines of what was just said. We have town meeting in June as well, and our plan was to not sign the contract until we knew if we could be eligible for funds through this bill. And we are planning to contact our Senator, Senator Ricciardi. I don't think she's one of the sponsors, but she was at the meeting our last meeting, and said to let her know if there was something she could do. So we are reaching out to her to see if how we could fit into this process. And I don't know, I mean, if our town approves the bond, and it's all the timing. It's all in the timing, right? I mean, if we find out if this is going to go into effect, hopefully we would know before June if it's going to go into effect in July. But, we can always amend our bond down to a matching amount if we think we'll get the bond, but it's all in the timing.
Well, two of the sponsors are that I'm familiar with are Jeb Bradley and Ruth Ward. Ruth hails from our region and might be able to drop in a little late to this meeting, so might be able to get a chance to talk to her today. Otherwise, I'll reach out to them, let you know what I hear. But anyway, it's something to watch. Obviously, a lot of questions about when it would launch too. I mean, being an effective program on July 1 doesn't mean that there's something in place for people to apply to either. Okay. So
Henry, I hate to jump in. I after all this time, Dana Pinney and Fitzwilliam can't find the raise my hand feature on my screen, so I apologize. I had reached out to Tammy and Jill and Gail up at the bond bank several times, and Tammy may be covering this, so I don't want to go too long. Tammy can raise her hand if she's going to discuss it. But that we had talked about some things, and timing is the issue, that maybe being able not getting the bond in in July, not going into that offering, taking a bond anticipation note, and going into the February bond auction, or that they might, depending on how many of these are delayed, they might have a special offering, so that as long as you haven't signed, it was my understanding, and I had this conversation with Rob and now Jeff at Consolidated, as long as you haven't signed a contract, you would still qualify from some of these funds. I don't know at what point the project, how long you delay it before the citizens get upset that you're not starting, but that's a thought that you can go to you can get your approval at your town meeting. And that's all you're getting at town meeting. You're not getting a bond, you're getting approval to, at some point in the future, could be in July, it could be in the future, to get that bond. So maybe Tammy will share more with that.
Yeah, we're going to make sure that, if you're going to get grant money, we don't want you to borrow that, because as, was discussed earlier, you can't pay your bonds off early. So, we'd want you to get that grant money and not borrow that money if you don't need to. So, we can work with each individual town. If somebody wants to go right away, regardless, and doesn't want, to look out for the grant money, just want to get it done, and we can include them in our tax exempt issue. But it sounds like, you might want to wait a little bit, and we can hold off and not follow the July sales schedule that we have going on right now. And, we can wait to see what comes down the pike. But I do suggest that you all get your applications in so that we are ready to go when it all comes down.
Thanks, Dana, for chiming in there, and Tammy. In some ways, it's great to have maybe not one but two paths, two financing options. We'll just have to stay on top of this potential state option. And I think Dana's saying that Consolidated's understanding, who most of you are planning to enter into agreements with, is that as long as that agreement isn't signed, it's basically considered a planned project. So I can, again, try to confirm that with the bill sponsors. Doug, did you have a follow-up?
I do. For a question for Tammy. Tammy, in turning in our applications for a bond, does that commit us to the bond being offered at the next sale of bonds, or can that be timed later on if need be?
No, the application is not a binding document. So basically, it's the application, you're saying, yes, you want to be in our sale at that point. It's not until you sign the loan agreement. The loan agreement is basically the document that says we want to go through the bond bank. And and this is why the timing isn't right, because that actually is due June 21st. Because we need to get the structure put together so that we can advertise our sale for July 13th.
Thank you.
Thank you both. It's your questions that are making this worthwhile. Next, let's take a look at the candidate topics. I'm just going to kind of breeze through them so folks can see what was covered last time. We can add any new ones that you might have on the tip of your tongue. And then I think we'll dive into those couple that deal with bonds more directly, and then work our way to the ones we haven't covered at all. So this is on the second page following your agenda. If you don't have it in front of you, you can find it on the broadband planning webpage of the SWRPC site. But just listing them off here, we talked about definitions for what townwide really is, and some considerations there, how the previous round of communities understood that. Questions about ownership and maintenance, especially when the bond is paid off, the town may own the infrastructure. the need for an inventory of what the town actually owns, the exact components. Questions about how that would be maintained over time as equipment is, it's going to be replaced or maybe even upgraded over 20 years. Talks about quality of service language, especially with respect to speeds. The idea that the town can enforce people getting what they're paying for, or talk about that. So the issue of maintenance and modernization happening during the span of the 20-year agreement. Number of things there for, let's see, related to resiliency of the equipment, maintenance of the what they have now, the DSL copper-based system. Talked about subcontractors and the installation of the infrastructure, how that would be kind of inspected or held up to an adequate standard. Talked about pricing. There's a lot of, there's seemed to be some variability about that between proposals and agreement language, things like that. Sometimes not a lot of detail, it sounds, in the draft language with respect to things like, say the router and access point, things like that. Access for lower income residents. This was a little more of a brainstorming session because it doesn't seem to appear anywhere in the agreement, but people wondered about how rates might be able to be subsidized or fees waived for certain households or individuals. And the last couple we covered, well, one we just got into a little bit here, but using other funds to make bond payments or offset the cost. Someone mentioned, there's certain towns that will probably, or excuse me, providers have applied for funds for certain parts of towns that might offset town bond amounts through the RDOF program. And community anchors, so kind of free connections to certain places in town, making a list of those, thinking about what categories should be considered. And I'll just put in a plug here for a previous database that was compiled in the state of what it calls community anchor institutions. So if you're in a community and you're not sure like where to start, this is a list that was compiled a few years ago that you could build on, and I'll put that in the chat as well. It's a little bit of an odd landing page when you get there, but you'll find an interactive map that you can zoom in and out to, and as well as export the data out into Excel. And the questions we didn't get to are basically 9, 12, and 13. Those are the ones we didn't get to at all. But for now, what I'd like to do is make sure we've got everything that people want to talk about. So are there any new things that folks want to add to the list? All right, go ahead, Dana.
I have something.
Dana, could you go first and then John?
Yeah, thank you. One thing that I've contemplated is, in the worst case scenario, 15 years from now, when Consolidated isn't performing on a contract, and the town owns the network, and there are provisions in the contract how the town can exit the contract in certain circumstances. The thing is that Consolidated owns, the town would own the fiber on the street, but they don't own any of the drops from the street to the houses and the ONT, the optical network terminal, and that equipment. So as the town terminates the contract, a couple of things. The town then has to pay a fee for pole access for their cable on the poles that they don't have to pay now. And the town would own the network and be able to market that. But what are they marketing? They're marketing what's on the street, but could Consolidated, how do you transfer that ownership of the drops to the house that the town doesn't own to another provider and not interrupt service to 1,500 potential customers? So that's a question that I had. Worst case, and probably 15 years from now, it won't be my problem, but it could be some of your problem.
Oh, thanks for the detailed description, Dana. I think I'm remembering Carol talking about that a little bit towards the top here. And just to remember that, again, as Dana was saying, the town infrastructure is literally is proposed to be physically attached to the Consolidated infrastructure. So we don't really have this is a missing question, I think, or missing item, but it would be like, what would how would subscribers continue to be served if the provider defaulted on their contract?
Essentially, yes. How would the town make the transition for the people in that instance?
Okay.
I think there's a simple answer for that.
John, was that you? Go ahead.
Yeah,
If you
there's
want.
a simple answer for that.
Yeah, we can take quick thoughts here, but mainly we want to add the questions. But go ahead, John.
Oh,
First of all, you have to distinguish who owns the rights to the lines. All right, at this very moment, Consolidated owns the rights to those lines. So you, town or private, any person, individual, whatever, your contract is going to be with Consolidated. If you discontinue your contract with Consolidated, you will be discontinuing your contract to have fiber optic because you're going to choose to go with somebody else. But the people that stay on the line that are private will not be affected in any shape, form, or manner.
I think I hear what you're saying, John. In the scenario Dana's talking about is like, what happens when Consolidated can no longer use the infrastructure to deliver service, and company X has to come in to actually start providing service.
There's an answer for that too. Right to this current moment, Consolidated was handed a basket of problems when they bought this company from Fairpoint. And Consolidated should be given a gold medal of honor for what they've done for the entire Cheshire County community to keep everybody running up to this point, because they've been handing hardware and components that are so obsolete. The stuff is 50, 75 years old stuff that they're keeping running for all you folks now. And they've been able to keep it all running up to this point. Well, if you hand them new technology, I kind of think they're going to be able to handle all that without even thinking about
Let's hope so. Carol, you've been waiting for a bit.
So I really think that it's an issue that we tried to address in the contracts. It's not an issue that I'm happy with the final result that's in the contracts because it's not really clear, but Consolidated pays for, in this construction process, that drop to the home. And so they, in essence, own that drop. Whether we like it or not, they paid for it. We have not paid for it. It's not part of what we bonded for. And as well as the equipment that's in the home. And so if we needed to terminate a contract, if indeed there was a bankruptcy or something else going on, we'd partner with somebody else and we would negotiate those drops to be moved to another carrier, another ISP. It says in the contract for a reasonable price or something along those lines. I mean, what is reasonable and who knows what that will be 10 or 15 years from now, but they indeed do own that drop. And so, there are a number of issues with going with Consolidated that are unknown. Exactly what is the list of items that you think you own. I've looked at some of the lists that people think are right or wrong, and they're different than from what I thought, right? And so the other is you're overlashed to their copper, and you're overlashed to their copper, and that's the reason why that to build the network is $1 million plus less than anybody else could do it. But what happens then? You're not a separate pole attachment. You're actually overlashed to their copper. So that in itself would have to be negotiated. We've done the best we can. We did Dublin, the other towns at that time to make it clear as possible how we would proceed. I think none of us know until and if that ever happens. I mean, I think we're all very hopeful that if something should happen to Consolidated with so much fiber on the poles and so many towns now with a fiber to the premise network, that there will be others interested in purchasing Consolidated. And so, and take over the whole function and take over these contracts. That would be the ideal world. Now, if the contracts aren't any good, do they continue to pay, in essence, what is the equal to the bond payment? I mean, that's another whole issue, right? If you file for bankruptcy, where do you fall in line? So I hate to lay more issues on the table than clarify. So I think you look at the agreements that have been signed to date, and if you can tighten them up in any way, then I think the new towns should try and do that. But that was the best we could do at the time.
Thanks, Carol. And that is exactly the purpose of this meeting, I think, to learn from each other. And if you have like specific ideas, if anyone has specific ideas about tightening it up, improving language, this is a great venue to share them. Doug, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I think part of the issue that would need thought is what would be the reason Consolidated would cease providing service for the systems that they are building for us. On the one hand, if they have somebody who comes along, another large company comes along and wants to buy them out and take that over, then that creates one set of issues. If they become insolvent and have to declare bankruptcy for one reason or another, then their assets would go into receivership, and that would be an asset that we would not have control over, but the receiver would. So I think that there are two different sets of criteria or circumstances where that might happen. In the first case, if they voluntarily, without a bankruptcy being involved, decide to sell to someone else, I think our contracts could be adjusted so that we might have first refusal to purchase the drops and the equipment from there into the house if need be. That gives us the option of saying thanks, but no thanks, or yes, that's advantageous. And that's a decision that would be made by those that are on the ground dealing with these issues at that point in time. I don't think there would be any implications relative to the bond issue, Tammy, since the infrastructure that's purchased with the bond would be just the lines that are run along the roads, not any drops as far as I'm concerned.
What are you thinking? How is that pertaining to the bond?
That what happens with the drop in the equipment in the house is completely unrelated to the bond and would
right.
have no impact upon
That's right.
bond matters.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, again, it ultimately boils down to you need to make your bond payments according to the RSA. So it's ultimately backed by taxpayer dollars if it falls apart.
Right.
Okay, that was a helpful back and forth. I think we got into some answers there a little bit, or ideas for improvements. Are there other topics that people felt were missing, from a list of things they're considering?
I wish my star 9 was working.
For raise hand. And again, if you're on video, you can also try to just raise your hand physically. I'll do my best calling you that way. Carol, you have your hand up again. Go ahead.
Right. So from a broader perspective, based on who has signed agreements or it's coming up at their town meeting for bonding this time around, I think we as a Southwest region need to determine who's left out. Okay, so many are now in that, and some of the ones that you don't see as having done anything about this are ones that have quite a cable plant. So we don't want to consider that necessarily left out, but there are some that are much smaller. As I look at it, like Richmond, what is Richmond doing, and how can we make sure that all the towns in the Southwest Region planning area have broadband? So some sort of analysis as to, who's left.
Yeah, it's something I can kind of mark down. As you say, there's some towns with pretty good cable providers and even some like who have TDS service with fiber options that are okay. And there's if everything went through this year, you'd basically have that would account for half of all the towns in a region if you count the last Chesterfield and your kind of cohort of towns, with the others not having improvements. So we can try to come up with a list and share that some way. Tom, do you have a new thing to add or comment?
Well, yeah, it's maybe related to what Carol was just talking about. Does anything about these contracts or these bonds or the process that everybody is currently following preclude forming one of these communication districts that you've done a couple of presentations about, but don't seem to have quite got off the ground yet? 2 or 3 years from now, I could imagine that it might be beneficial for all the towns in this region or some large group of the towns in this region to pool their assets and their expertise or lack of expertise, as the case may be, into a communications district and get benefits that way to flesh out the few that are left and that haven't got it done. But does the current process stop us from doing that? Would there be a problem with that?
It's a good question. I'm going to add it to the list, and I'll let anyone chime in while I'm typing. Okay, I'll have to wordsmith that later. Maybe, John, did you have a new item to list or comment?
I think that I agree that you should contact each and every town in our district. I think we should, publish a letter, saying, look, if you haven't signed a contract, don't sign a contract because there's some bonding and this money available. And I know for a fact that, from a consolidated communications point of view, consolidated, what they want to look at is how many people they're going to be able to service. They look at numbers. That's how they justify their cost and their investment. And if all the towns join together in our region, there's no reason why you can't reach out for a regional bond as well as a town bond. There's no reason why you can't, and have everybody be on the same page at the same time.
Well, except if we all already have individual bonds, we can't prepay them early. That's what Tammy said. So
That's just another reason to reach out and get everybody working together, networking. This is a big fiasco. This thing is big. This is not small. People are tired of copper. They're tired of their connections being dropped. They're tired of slow speeds, and people are trying to go too fast. There need to be more people reaching out and talking about it.
So John, it's a fair point, and I think, on one hand, this group has been many people's attempts to work together, but for various reasons, towns have they've choose this because it's basically the most efficient way to get from A to B. Communication districts are very new. It's not a worn track as the one they're following. So those are a couple reasons, but again, it doesn't prohibit kind of the rest of the region from taking a different route. I'd like to make sure we get into the substance of these a bit. Doug, did you have a quick thought or a missing item from the list?
Yeah, on that last point, I think if I recall correctly, I had some conversation with Rob from Consolidated about the issue, and I asked him, in the various places where they are doing these sorts of things in rural communities, what's been the most difficult thing for him to deal with, and what states and municipalities were the toughest ones for them to manage. And communication districts, I don't know that that's the correct title, but there's something like it in Vermont. He says they've been a nightmare, and it's really held up the process. And I think, to John's point, though, I think that the communities of southwestern New Hampshire do need to be talking to each other and talking to the legislators and to the players, Consolidated, whatever, and saying, we may be proceeding individually. There may be a point where we may need to do some things collectively, but don't discount us because we're small individual communities, because we're all talking to each other and we're willing to cooperate. So I think John's point's well taken, that we need to have good communication out to the communities and tell them what could be done, how it could be done. I think that's one of the ways this group has been so helpful, so that they know what they're getting into and what's maybe the best course of action and what their timing is going to be, and whether they're going to be using the bond bank and the stuff that, the things that Tammy told us today in terms of, get your application in if you've gotten approval for that in your town, but that doesn't mean you have to jump into the next sale and participate. So I think that, some kind of good communication device that goes out to all the communities would be very helpful, so everybody's up to speed, because not everybody can get on the call, and not everybody can get on a call like this every time either. So thank you, John, for those comments.
I've been all over this stuff for a long time. I've been in planning. I've done a lot of planning, networking. I've done a lot of this stuff, and getting people to communicate is a big, big deal, and getting these towns pulled together. Our planning commission, Southwestern Regional Services, they service all of our towns. Southwestern could send a letter right out to everybody, say, look, this is what's going on. We should have a town meeting of towns, of all the towns. So everybody can put in their comments at that meeting and voice themselves.
It's a good idea, John. Carol, go ahead, and then we'll start into the content.
I was just thinking about that. A couple of things. One, we can do districts in New Hampshire, and they put in some barriers last time that hopefully will be removed with Senate Bill 88, meaning that the towns can set up the committee without having to go to town meeting. I think that was a big barrier to doing a district in New Hampshire. Perhaps the towns that are left in the region can do a district. I know that Dublin and others went ahead because it was an opportunity to move forward, and the communication between towns was difficult. Everybody wasn't on the same page as to what they were looking for. But I think as a result of this, 6 towns have moved forward. Others have done so since then. So I think that's an important piece. And I think districts in New Hampshire are whatever you want to call them, but I think they're called communication districts in the language, are a really good thing. This region might not have enough towns left to do that. So that's something that we need to sort of think about and move it forward, unless you do it after the fact, and then you have to consider why are you doing it. And maybe why you're doing it is things like digital equity and education, those types of goals, including those individuals who can't afford to pay. So there might be other reasons to do a district besides just building the network. I can't let the comment go by. EC Fiber in Vermont, a district of 31 towns, 1,400 miles of network, 6,000 customers on board, most of them coming from Consolidated. It's no wonder that they don't like communication districts in Vermont. And what they've been trying to do in Vermont is cherry pick towns that they want, leaving others unserved, or building in areas in which they're not doing universal service. So they've told the state they're focusing on overbuilding the cable in the major areas, Brattleboro, Montpelier, Rutland, so that they can gain back their customers that they've lost to the cable companies. And then they have the RDOF areas. They have also one that they intend to serve, but they do not intend to do universal access in those towns. And they've made it really clear to the Department of Public Service. So this is not something that is, hasn't been said. So I can see why they're nervous, but the first RFP has gone out in Vermont for Deerfield Valley, which is down by Brattleboro and Bennington. And so we'll see what the responses are for that RFP to do construction in that area. So that is moving along, and CCI did put in a proposal. I'm not privy to what it says because I'm involved in another proposal, but I know that they have responded to that, and I'm sure they will throughout the Vermont as they move forward.
Thanks, Carol. And,
Yep,
and
just an
a shameless plug, Carol's featured not 1, but 2 presentations in the region about communication districts. You can find those at previous meetings. I want to shift gears and talk about what we wanted to cover the most here were some of these topics. Let's try to get through these and maybe cover odds and ends. There's extra time. And there are basically 2 questions that talked about bonds most heavily. The first one is this number 2, if I'm remembering right, and it talks about ownership and maintenance following bond payoff. The questions people brought up were one, well, we already talked about, making sure there's a certainty about who owns what, but also the difference between taxable and non-taxable bonds. And kind of consistent duration of agreement between the contract with the provider and the term of the bond.
I can-
Tammy, was there
yeah.
anything you wanted to dive into there?
Well, I can certainly talk about the taxable and tax exempt. The other questions I think are more legal because, I mean, we're giving you the money, you're doing the project. What you do with that afterwards is, is more, your legal counsel to answer those questions for you because I don't have the answer there. But as far as taxable and tax exempt is what we normally pull together in our issues. And that is basically because the projects are for public purpose. Taxable issues would be if it's a private purpose. And what we found when we were working with Chesterfield in the beginning, and I was working with Rennell, was that because the towns were not going to own the equipment, and they don't want to own the equipment. And then the Consolidated Communications was collecting the user fees to make the debt service payment. So those two things alone make it for a private purpose. Unless you wanted to collect the fees in the town and own the equipment, it'd have to be a taxable issue. And what we found was with interest rates so low right now, why not pull you all together and make it and put out a taxable issue if that was in the contract, if that was the best way to go. So when we did that, I mean, for instance, let me back up a little bit. Chesterfield was the first one to do the broadband. And when in our tax exempt issues, we are allowed to have 5% of taxable debt in our bond issues. So because our issue was large enough, we were able to accommodate Chesterfield in our bond issue. So he got a tax exempt rate. However, that was January of 2020. Then we had COVID happen. And then we had 5 other communities come in for our July pool as a taxable issue, and they got a 20-year interest rate of 2.04. So it's all about timing. It's all about how the market is. We'll continue to do these taxable sales as long as interest rates are low and we're giving you a good rate. I think that's all I had to say on that. I don't know if anyone had any other questions.
Tammy, this is Carol Monroe.
Hi, Carol.
The reason why they changed the contracts for the last 5 towns and leaving the towns with ownership, complete ownership of the network that's being built with the bond funds was so they could be non-taxable bonds and not have to go into the taxable situation. And as it turns out, last year was fine because interest rates were so low, it didn't matter. But it may matter as we move forward. And so I think that if the agreements are such as they have been for the last 5 towns where the town maintains ownership of the network, I think the council, legal counsel has indicated then they should they could possibly be and should be non-taxable and have the benefits of a non-taxable bond for the people who are buying them, of course. That's what's important on that side. So I just wanted to make sure that it didn't matter last year, but it could very much matter. And that's one piece of that agreement that needs to be really clear. It's about owning the asset after the fact for that purpose, exactly.
Yeah, and I think the same for this year too. The interest rates are rising, but I still think they're low right now. And I still think a taxable issue would still produce a low interest rate. But I agree, Carol. I mean, basically for the bond bank, we look for a legal opinion. That legal opinion from your bond counsel tells us whether it's a taxable bond or a tax exempt bond.
Okay, thanks. I think that was the clarity we needed on that one. The other question that talked about the bonds was number 11 for the other topic.
10.
Wait, is that right? No, that can't be right. Ken, yeah. So, yeah, okay, and the question deals with paying off the bond through some other means, I guess is the short of it.
Yeah, so basically you cannot pay your bonds off early. And then with this American Rescue Plan, and this SB 85 that's coming up, like I stated earlier, you know, we don't want to go in July if we're not, if you're going to get this grant money. So, and like Dana had mentioned earlier, you know, we'll either postpone this sale until, you know, we get an answer, or we can finance your projects with bond anticipation notes. And then, because a bond anticipation note is a short-term note that gives you funding until you actually bond it. So then say you got 50% grant, but you did a band for 100%, but when you get the 50% grant, you only have to bond the 50% that's left over. The problem with that is the way this sounds like you wouldn't really want to do that, because you can't start your project and be eligible for this, is what it sounds like.
Yeah, I think that's what it looks like.
But we're watching this closely, and we'll be letting you all know. I mean, we have 12 applications out of the 14 towns that had broadband on their warrants this year. So like I said, I encourage you to get those in, so at least we're ready and prepared.
And I assume, Tammy, the ability to pay off a bond early doesn't change if it's taxable or non-taxable. Okay.
The only way you could do that is if you borrowed on your own, but it's too costly to do that. And the reason why you can't pay your bonds off early with the bond bank is because what we do is we pool all the loans into one New Hampshire municipal bond bank bond, so that's what's sold in the market is a bond bank bond. So we have to pay our bondholders until the loan is paid off. So we can't have individuals paying off their loans early, because we still need to pay our bondholders at every principal and interest date.
Right. Okay, that was helpful to me for those questions that were brought up under those topics. Are there any other like bond related questions that are tied to these that I'm missing and people want to get answered now? Dana, go ahead. Oh, you're still muted, Dana.
Oh, you're muted, Dana.
How about if I unmute? Is that better?
Here we go.
Okay. It
Much
might be the same either way. I've thought along the way that CCI will collect the infrastructure fee from the various towns, and it's a different number for every town based on the bond. But as far as determining how often that should be reviewed, we will never know how many customers in our town CCI actually has. I don't believe they will ever disclose that number. It's proprietary information. So there's a big leap of faith that they're working with good numbers and are reducing or not reducing based on actual numbers. But we will never be able to tell what the participation rate is, I don't believe.
Thanks, Dana. I didn't know that.
Well, why do you say that? They were fairly open about sharing their subscribers in their RFI responses. And I don't know how we would be able to have a negotiation about those rates without them making some representations about what their take up is.
I think I base that on something that one of the members in one of the other towns that had done this. If, for instance, some towns have in our area, Argent and Wye Valley and and CCI. And CCI has no incentive to tell Argent how many customers they have or vice versa. And somebody in another town that's done this previous shared, I'm certain with me that that's proprietary information. When you ask what was the take rate in their town, so if you have, Fitzwilliam has about 1,500 potential customers at this point that CCI could sign up. But when you ask them the actual take rate, that's my understanding, not something that they're going to be willing to share. I could be wrong. I have been before.
Well, I'm usually a cynic about these things, so I'm generally in your camp.
Make a comment on that, Brad Chesterfield?
Thanks, Brad.
Yeah, it's stated in our contract that they will provide that information every 2 years when we renegotiate the rate, and it has to be presented to the selectmen so they can review that and agree to it. So it's in the contract.
Yeah, and that's true for you in Chesterfield, but the other contracts have a flat, they're paid a flat fee to operate the network. And it's not directly related to their bond, and it doesn't discuss reducing the $11 or $10 or whatever it is, a subscriber fee in the same detail as you do in Chesterfield.
Okay.
Yeah,
I guess one of the big changes is the fact of the ownership.
Yep.
We
That's
we did not want to own the network. You know, once they own it, they start paying us taxes on it. So that's one thing for us. And the other thing is we're so small. I mean, have us owning that asset is just too much overhead for a town to even worry about.
Yeah, so.
Thank you both for pointing out the difference. So if that language is the same as Ringe, was the same year as Dublin, folks could look on the meeting resources link on our webpage to take a look at that and compare it against your own agreement that you're reviewing.
They have been willing to tell me how many people have subscribed in Dublin, but we don't have any competition. So that might be one reason why they're willing to do that.
All right. Well, let's take a look at the questions where we haven't had any conversation at all. If I look up to the top here, number 9, I think it might have been Tom who pointed out last time that there's a short window for the town to kind of give the thumbs up to the actual construction. I don't know. It doesn't seem like we talked about it at all. But are there still questions about this? Things people want to say? And that's fine. We can come back to any of these too, but I'd want to touch on the ones we didn't talk about at all. Oh, Doug, go ahead.
Yeah, on that point, and this is a question for Tammy, what kind of documentation do you require, if any, at whatever point the system that has been funded by the bond has been constructed and has been accepted? Do we have to give some kind of official notice to you that that process is, that the construction is complete, it's been accepted by the town?
Well, we send an expenditure notification out every 3 years. So we would just want to make sure that your proceeds were spent within 3 years. That's the follow-up that we do. But basically, yeah, I mean, we try to make this as simple as possible. Like I said, you know, we make sure we review your application. We make sure everything was done legal. We give you the funds, and then, you know, we don't really monitor your project. And one other point I wanted to make, Henry, when I was looking at your notes is postponing the bond sale to February. We can go at any time. So say, you know, we know in October that, you know, what you're receiving for fund, we can pull an issue at any time.
Thank you, Tammy.
Did I answer your question, Doug?
Yes, you did. Thank you.
Okay. Let's maybe move on to number 12 here. I know we didn't touch on that at all. And the gist of it was, it's a little bit short. It just, considering the need to obtain payment or performance bonds. I assume that's from the ISP, but could someone talk about that?
That came-
Yeah, that was my question, and it's just whether that's something that towns have considered, either or both of those, in terms of negotiations with Consolidated.
Thanks for the reminder, Jan. And I actually don't have expertise in this area. Maybe it'd be helpful if someone could explain how these are used in other places, for what reasons they're used in other projects.
So it has to do with and I'm no lawyer, so my understanding will be limited, but it has to do with default on the part of the provider, whether they don't make payments that they're supposed to make, or they don't construct the network in the way intended, then we have recourse.
Is it kind of like insurance, sort of?
Yeah, somewhat like that, yes.
And they would go out to like a third party or a bank and obtain that?
Yeah, they would go to a third party and get this bonded, essentially. So that we would have the assurance that if they don't come through, then we have this other avenue. But I'm not seeing that this is something that others have thought about, or maybe they've thought about it and decided it wasn't necessary. Perhaps it's not in anyone's contract currently.
Could anyone respond to that? Like, has anyone thought about this, or is this a new idea to you? Is it in any of the existing contracts?
There is a late performance penalty in the Schedule A network construction, section 20, where they have a late performance penalty. If they haven't completed it within 2 years and 30 days, they will pay $1,000 a day penalty. But I don't see anything about bonding to cover missed payments or anything like that. I think their perspective on that is that if they default, then we're in that situation where we're buying the or getting somebody else to operate the network.
Okay.
Henry,
so-
I think
Go ahead.
Consolidated has all of those liability responsibilities already, especially on performance or any other question you may have. They already have to be bonded with the FCC to even own the rights to those lines on the pole out there. So I think you'll find, if you do research, they're already bonded, they're already insured, they're already everything already. Which is done through the Federal Communications Committee.
Thanks for sharing, John. I mean, you can kind of see we're primarily like informal, non-expert group, with a lot of exceptions in certain areas. But okay, so
I just
maybe
like to
let's-
use good old-fashioned common sense.
So, I mean, on that one, maybe there's, with any of these, when you're not getting answers from the group here, I think it just means that you may need to ask others, like especially town council, I would think. Let's continue on here. This one was a little bit vague, and I may need a refresher too. Responsibilities of a provider to respond to requests from a local government. And I assume that means like the town asks for something like how many subscribers there are. There's a certain number of days to respond, or I guess could someone give some examples about requests that they want to include? Yeah, go ahead, Doug.
The only thing I can envision beyond that would be if there was some kind of maintenance issue relative to the lines that the town owns that they're not performing on. Obviously, they are under contract to maintain these lines and keep them functional. But should that not happen for any kind of reason, you could put language in the contract that would specify that any requests for maintenance or requests for information regarding system status or number of customers, that needs to be replied to within X number of business days. Other than that, I can't think of anything that would be a compelling reason to demand information back.
Okay. I know from looking at things like cable franchise agreements, each agreement with a town lists some official ways to contact, that provider, name, address, phone number. So I assume that's present in these agreements as well.
Nope.
So number 14, that's a real big question. I think that's maybe not one that can be answered in the short term, but this was a new one we added. If anyone wants to share any thoughts about how this would influence, people as they work on their agreements, now would be a good time.
So I was thinking it might be helpful to just add a bullet point in the agreement somewhere that says that nothing in the agreement will be construed to prevent future merging into communications districts, or something like that, to just acknowledge the possibility and put it out there. I'm not quite sure how that language should look, but I think it would be better to say something than to leave it empty.
Yeah, I think part of it goes to, well, we don't have communication districts to think about, and the reasons why communities put them together, vary. So it's probably hard for us to answer this right now.
Exactly. It's all pretty vague right now.
Yeah, if the town's already, financing one network, what reasons would they want to go on into a second one?
Well, one reason might be that, after you've operated it for a couple of years, you realize that you're not really happy with the exclusive arrangement, and that you want to buy the drops to the houses. And so the 3 or 4 towns get together, raise the money independently to do that, and basically buy consolidated out of that portion of the network, and then operate an open network that multiple ISPs can use. I'm just making stuff up, but that might be a reason why you do it.
That was really helpful, Tom. John, go ahead.
Being really big on network stuff, you will never see a town buy up any accounts. Who's going to service them? There ain't nobody in the town smart enough to service them. So that's,
Well, no, you wouldn't be buying the accounts. You'd be buying the equipment so that all the,
you're still going to be up against the same fence post. There is nobody that's going to maintain those servers. There's nobody that's going to maintain the equipment, and there's nobody going to maintain the connections. Not going to happen.
okay.
Yeah. It's,
Like I said, I was just making stuff up.
yeah. It certainly not quickly. So I'm seeing a note from Tammy that she's going to have to bounce out here. She's left her contact info. And many of you probably know how to reach her already, but thank you for joining, Tammy. And does anyone have any, like, a last question? I think we're probably good. So
All right,
feel free to
thank you,
drop me when you need to leave, when you need to go.
All right, thank you so much.
Okay, great. So I think we've addressed, at least in part, you know, all the questions that originally came up. I'd like to maybe invite you to scroll over the copy that you might have in front of you from my email or the webpage, and ask, like, is there, what do people want to dig into a little bit more?
Has there been any communication of any new technology that's going to be above this coming up in the future?
People are signing up for Starlink. So in Vermont, there are a number of people who have signed up for Starlink. They're getting over 100 down and about 20 up in terms of the results. But, you know, it's still in those beta kind of stages, but it may happen.
So, and for those of you who don't know, Starlink is a network of low Earth satellites. Like Carol said, it's in beta. They did apply for a large amount of funding through the FCC Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, including for some census blocks in our region. And I think the peak performance remains to be seen, but it's much more comparable to a terrestrial network than a satellite network. And I think it's priced around it'll be priced around $100 a month.
Can't compete with fiber.
No, nothing can, but if you're off the grid, it might be a good solution. So yeah, I agree with you, John. There really is very little that can really compete. But in some cases, this might be a solution for some homeowners who have a very long drop and really can't, half a mile or so, and can't move forward with any other service. So we'll see how it goes. But it is performing. It's about a $500 install cost, just for the record, equipment cost. So.
And again, I just want to defend fiber. Fiber is easy to repair and is unlimited in distance. It's very easy to fix. And it doesn't corrode like copper does either.
You're right. It's absolutely the best solution.
Let's see, I think Doug, you were first with your hand up, and then Dana.
Yeah, in terms of developing technologies, if I recall, I don't recall the exact name, but is it SPON, the type of fiber that's being run that has a maximum of 2 gigabits? They use a different type of technology for business fiber. I don't know whether we want to put something into the contract, thinking 20 years down the road, how technology will change. Will 2 gigabit capacity be adequate 20 years from now, or should there be something in the contract that would specify, the need to continue to upgrade the technology so that it is competitive?
Has anybody heard the name genocide mentioned?
Not sure
Nobody's
what you're
heard of
talking
it?
about.
Nope.
Genocide is going to be 100 times faster than the 5 gig that everybody's using on their cell phones right now. Genocide is going to be 100 times faster than that. SpaceX has a bunch of investors, and that's what they're building. Is they're building a satellite, and they want to dominate the whole world. They're going after the world. They want everybody's business.
Dana, go ahead.
I had a question, and Carol might be, if she's willing to, good one to answer this. I was speaking with a technician this week at the local consolidated office. And he was talking about the quality of work that's being done. And of course, there's competition. The consolidated technicians feel when they hook up fiber to the pole or hook up a distribution cabinet, that it's done professionally and neat and orderly, and that the subcontractors that are coming from around the country are kind of slamming things into the cabinet and trying to get things done. So how much of that is actual and how much of it is pride for the company and chilling for the company is questionable. But my question would be, because the town's going to own a lot of that part of it, is it important to know the quality of the work that's being done and put in? Carol has a lot of experience with EC fiber. And Miles, do you check the cabinets and have independent contractors look at the work and verify the quality, or is that just trust CCI and that they'll monitor their contractors?
2 things. One, they have a lot to lose if the quality's not there, because they have to maintain it going forward. And the second, though, is that in EC Fiber, we have a quality control inspector who follows our construction contractor and make sure they do what they're supposed to do. So for an example, you're absolutely right. Some of the quality of the drops hasn't been what it should be. They've gone through a few contractors that they've outsourced to, and some have left. And so I think they're trying to clean that up. There are things that they've done that EC Fiber wouldn't have done, like to connect people in March. They ran their fiber over the ground, through the trees, next to the driveway, with the idea they'll come back in the spring and put it in their conduit. Now, that isn't something that's normally done. That's not something that I would have done, but they did it. And so now we're trying to figure out, do we, I want to make sure that they do it right, that they come back and do it right. These customers want to make sure of that too. So I think there's some concerns there. I don't know about the other towns, but I'm seeing splice cases on the ground. I know that they've done that because of they probably have various contractors going through, and they don't want to bring a bucket truck every time. But it's not done till they're hung where they're supposed to be, up on the wires. Those are things that I'm watching kind of closely here in Dublin. And I think there's been a lot of conversation on our listserv about most of those issues, which is next door. That's what we use as the listserv here. So people have been talking a lot. Running the fiber and overlashing it to the copper is being done by here in Dublin, and I think in Ringe it's being done by a different company, but also very reputable. That it's not rocket science. Where you really run into issues is in the splicing, which is more precise work. And there have been some issues with customers getting service because of light levels not being where they should be. And the consolidated people, who are union, of course, had to go back and fix that. So they're not really happy about that, because that's where I think you get this pointing fingers. They did a lousy job and we have to fix it. They're not unionized. They don't know what they're doing. There is friction between friction meaning not not physical friction, but just when you listen to them talk, the unionized people are not happy that they've got so many outside contractors on the ground. I believe that's true across the region.
Well,
They
Henry,
don't
if you-
have the staff.
I'm sorry, Carol, I interrupted. I'm
No,
sorry.
I just want to say they don't have the staff to do this on their own. They have to outsource, and and it's going to get worse because contractors are going to get, I know that Eustis, for an example, and Waveguide, they're looking at their schedules over the next 3 years, and because everyone's going to be building, not just Consolidated, with all this money coming down from the FC, from the Fed, there's going to be a whole lot of construction going on in this world, and there just are not going to be enough contractors. Pricing will go up as well.
So Henry, if I could follow up with Carol on just two quick things. Carol, you, as I understand it, took over the project manager responsibilities in Dublin, and you have experience, but the rest of our towns, I know, for instance, I know nothing about what a splicing cabinet should look like, or if they're using good quality fiber or poor quality. Should that be a concern for us? And is there something that you would see that could or should be written into a contract to protect the town, or is it necessary?
I personally don't think it's necessary. Even when we do quality control in Vermont, we seldom find issues with that piece of the network. And the other, and there are other things that we might find, but they're in Consolidated's best interest to make sure it happens, like doing the down guides and so on, and down guides, all of that type of thing. But where the issues could arise is if the splicing isn't done correctly, but that's going to show up on a customer service. So there's not going to be enough light level, and that customer is not going to get the service that they need or they've signed up for, or it's going to be flaky. And so anytime that that's occurred here, and there has been some, Consolidated has sent out and respliced it. So that I think will show up fairly quickly. I don't think you need to look at it. And those are not things that you can go and open up the cabinet and say, wow, this doesn't look like an organized person. It's a mess, but it's not going to tell you much by looking inside the cabinets. But there shouldn't be anything hanging on the ground. I mean, these are the splice cases that should be up on the wires, the brown, black, sort of like, they almost look like a football splice cases. And so those things are not, they're not placed where they should be right now. It'd be like having fiber hanging off the poles and on the ground. I mean, those cleanup things have to be done. But no, I don't really think you need to have somebody out there doing that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dana. That's just the type of thing we're trying to learn from each other on, is how these concerns translate to the agreements, what the town might consider. Go ahead, Doug.
Yeah, I agree with Carol. I think that Consolidated has a lot of skin in the game to do this the right way, and there will be hiccups along the way as we have increased competition for qualified builders of networks. And I think that there is going to be a nationwide shortage of those things. So that having been said, maybe it would be wise in the contracts to put in that we reserve the right to have an independent inspector. Just reserve the right to have an independent inspector of those portions of the network that will be funded by the bond. That just gives us a legal right to say, here's how we're going to do it. There have been enough issues that are not being resolved in a timely manner that that we need to have somebody come in from the outside and take a look at it. Back on the communications district sort of thing, and other reasons why it is we might want to have a communications district. It's that sort of thing, where if we pulled together and said, we're all going to agree to use this person as the independent evaluator of those technical things that a lot of us don't know enough about to be able to go in and say, this is good or this is not. But I think writing into the contract, reserving the right to have an independent analysis of the quality of work might be possible. How much CCI will balk at that, I don't know, but I'm all for keeping people honest and keeping them accountable.
I think it's a reasonable request. So I think you can add that in, and I think it would be a reasonable request to do that. The people we use, just for, so you know, in Vermont, is we have 2 individuals who used to work for Fairpoint a long time ago, and don't any longer, and they do this part-time for us, and they're very good. So there are individuals like that out there, retired telecom people who can follow up and do and make sure that things are done right.
Good to know. So, so we're losing some attendees, which is normal because we've been going for 90 minutes. I guess how are people feeling about, you know, what you got to talk about? Have we kind of gone as far as we can with this list? What would you like to do for the rest of the time? Or would you like to wrap things up? Any comments or feedback would be appreciated.
From looking at what you got drawn up, Henry, I'd say you got a pretty large list for any provider there to answer to.
Yeah, and these are this is a big list, and you know, not all of them may be
I don't think
appropriate or
I don't
realistic.
think they're all going to pertain, but so be it.
Well, I would think the next thing is to take this to the town's attorneys and say, you know, here's some of the concerns. Here's the template from Consolidated. How do we turn that into proposed contract negotiation or amendments or whatever? We could all do that independently.
Work together.
Or do it all together. I think.
Yeah, or find a way to do it all together, but who's going to pay the attorney?
So Dublin did use Chindella's office, Attorney Chindella's office, Kate Miller, who's a telecom attorney and has done work for various municipalities in the state to look at our agreement. And so she has a baseline, you know, at least a baseline. I'm not sure who the other towns used in that process, but we didn't think our local town attorney, who normally we ask questions about, you know, process and procedure and policy, could really do it. And so if you think that there's a chance that you might want a sort of a template contract, and everybody can, you know, kind of maybe there are certain things that are specific to a given town, but the bulk of it would be the same. That might be a way to go. So we paid her to do it. Kate Miller at Chindella. Donahue, Tucker and Chindella is the law firm.
Doug, go ahead.
Yeah, I love the idea of, you know, what can be boilerplated to be done by somebody with expertise on these kind of issues, and then take it to our town attorneys. I can't imagine that any town would want to sign on without having their own attorney at least give it a once over. But, you know, the point is well taken. When you get into technical issues, you need somebody who has been, who is versed in that to give it the good thought that it's needed. You know, the sticking point becomes, you know, how do we pay for it?
John, go ahead.
My input is going to be, you guys, you know, from a legal perspective, I totally agree with what you're saying with the towns, you know, having a legal perspective, but all of our municipalities already have legal counsel of things being correct, because these companies have to answer to the FCC. Again, this is where the FCC gets involved. Federal Communications, everybody who is out there marketing their service they have to answer to the FCC. And that's a little bit of assurance we get.
When you asked about who's going to pay for it, Consolidated paid for it. So keep that in mind. I don't know if they'll do it anymore, but they did pay for, and they did not hire that attorney. We just submitted bills after the fact.
Oh, I like that.
So I'm not sure where they are on that today, but that's where they were then.
So that kind of sounds like maybe Henry's group could ping Consolidated and say, hey, would you guys mind paying for a little time for the group here?
Well, I mean, it's a good reason for our organization to reach out, because we know like many communities could be interested in it. And it's something I'd want to check with my staff director on, but I think it's possible. Has anyone been given a deadline for returning an agreement or signing one? Not yet. Okay, so there could be some time left. I mean, this is just me, but I would think Consolidated would actually want, one standard agreement.
Yeah.
And not,
I would
12,
think that's
12 new
how you
ones
sell it to
in our
them.
region.
Yeah, sell them the idea, one agreement instead of 12.
Yeah, I agree. I think that Consolidate would rather dance with one partner than with 15, at least when it comes to reading a contract. And, it cuts their costs. It gives understandability to everybody. It's kind of an informal way of our acting together as a group without having a communications district. There's, more than one way to skin a cat here, and I think this would be a good solution. Although I still think that most towns are going to want to have the final product of whatever is going to be signed be looked at by their own attorney.
Sure.
Just as part of due diligence for the town.
Mhm.
This is a great transition to like next steps, everyone. So this is great. Dana, go ahead.
Henry,
Oh, you muted yourself again. I can't read your lips for some reason.
Still muted.
Still muted.
there we go.
There you go.
I had a recent conversation with Rob Custer, and because there's a lot of towns doing contracts, they'd like to see contracts come in so that they can, review them and negotiate them with towns. But he very much recommended that no town sign it. So you can do contracts anytime you want, and if they have no, they would rather. They don't want to miss out on any federal funds for themselves or for the towns. So they want to negotiate the contract, have it ready to go, but sign it the day before they start work, almost, type of thing.
Yep, I had a similar conversation, Dana, with Rob on that very issue. He said, put it off as long as possible in case you can find other funding. And, at the moment where everybody's ready to jump ahead, then that's the point to sign.
That's what they told us too.
Okay, well that should like a minimum deadline would be something related to the bond sale. So I think we know there's 3 months or so anyway.
Mhm.
Henry, how are we going to stay informed on this? What is it,
Yeah.
SB 85 thing?
Yeah, there's no place where you can sign up for announcements. If you visit our page, there's a legislative section where we direct you to the docket. And that's where they post all of the public hearings and votes, when the next hearing is. I think it's not till May for the House. So you kind of just, my approach has been to just check back on that. Although there are some third-party legislative type websites like Legiscan that might, minimize how much you have to do that.
What committees does it have to work its way through before it comes to the floor?
Here, I can open that right now. It's in the House Finance Committee,
Okay,
and it says due out of committee May 27th.
one of the things we could do is talk to the sponsors and say if there's any way that they could jump the curve on that and explain to them the issue relative to the bonding for all these towns. And, is there any way that they could fast track that and jump the curve a little bit?
Yeah. For one, it was suggested that we reach out to the original bill sponsors, the senators, to bring up the question about planning versus construction. And I could just kind of informally mention that other issue.
Yeah.
See what we hear. But if the group wants to put something in writing, as a group, or of course you could do so independently, the link I sent will take you right to the committee address and contacts.
I think you could contact Gene Shaheen's office directly and have another one of your meetings like you got right now, and Gene Shaheen would probably come right in and join us.
She might, and this is the state legislative process though, so she would have less to say about that.
Well, she's a big push on broadband.
Yeah, and Senator Hassan's come to our region to talk to folks as well.
Might as well reach right for the top, don't shortcut.
So my follow-ups are to reach out about that piece of legislation, and I have a list of who's attended these last two meetings to discuss the agreements. I will update either the whole Monadnock Broadband Group or just the folks that have attended these sessions about what the Planning Commission would do to reach out to Consolidated and the other provider about a standard agreement.
Thanks, Henry.
So we covered a couple next steps. Is there other feedback to share about how this went or anything else before we adjourn?
Did everybody agree, Henry, to send letters out to the towns to see if they might be interested in, approaching all of this in a broader spectrum? I mean, did the folks kind of sound like they wanted to do that?
Well, and so John, the folks attending these meetings are kind of a subset of what we think of as the Monadnock Broadband Group, because they've all sort of they're all on a short-term track in a implementation plan, if you will. And the idea of going with a district, I think, is what you're thinking of, is in some ways a whole different direction.
It's a different direction because the towns are trying to stay independent to themselves, and I understand that. But I mean, when you're talking about this system that all the towns are trying to join the same system, geez, it seems like we ought to have the same page for everybody.
Yeah, we've featured communication districts a number of times at meetings, and there's been some interest, but to me at least, I think it kind of goes back to New Hampshire let towns bond first, and then a couple years later they let them look at communication districts. So it's where we are is kind of a result of that. People went after that first tool first. And they're still kind of tweaking the communication districts. As it stands now, if towns wanted to do it, they wouldn't even be able to start planning until next town meeting. Whereas towns that are talking right now could be, subscribing onto their networks by that time. So,
And there's nothing stopping these towns from holding a special meeting either.
Yes, there is.
um,
You can't have a special meeting for this. We already tried.
I don't know the requirements for that, but I think it's not like it's just a matter of time, before this comes up again. I think you're dropping in on kind of a narrow discussion this time it's meant for maybe a subset of towns. Cool. I mean, any just general feedback on how this went?
Can
Oh.
I ask a question?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Go ahead, Dale.
Somebody just said that they couldn't do a special town meeting because we were talking to Annelle and she said that, I'm from Croydon, by the way. She said that she thought you might be able to do it, that it has to be an emergency and that broadband nowadays is kind of considered an emergency because, you've got all these kids and people trying to work from home. And so whoever just said that a second ago, did you actually try and do a special meeting?
That was me. We talked about it. We talked to the town's attorney about it, and they didn't think that it, and this was almost a year ago when things felt much more urgent. And our attorney anyway, didn't think that it met the criteria. He didn't think that we could justify that. You might have different opinions, but we did at least float the idea.
So,
Okay, well, that's it.
and Dublin looked at it, and you could do a special town meeting without it being an emergency, but you would need that same percentage of voters passing it. And in that case, it's the voting, all the voters in town, not just who shows up at the special town meeting.
Oh my gosh.
Unlike your town meeting in March or in this year, it's April, May, or whatever it is, where it's, it's a certain percentage of the voters at town meeting, unless it's an emergency town meeting. And our attorney didn't think it was an emergency that would count as an emergency, but you could do a regular meeting, but I don't know that you'd get the right percentage of voters voting at all, say nothing in favor.
Yeah, sounds like it's a pretty high hurdle, even though it's possible.
Oh, you have to send a letter out and say, are you in favor of broadband internet or not? And watch them flock to you.
Well, I mean, like on our survey, everybody is in favor of it. So, maybe they would turn out for the meeting then.
I think they would.
Yeah. All right, thanks.
The information, Henry, that we had received was that you can have special town meetings, but if you're trying to appropriate funds over $100,000, you must do it at a regular town meeting. So there's a money restriction. Most of these projects are well over 100,000, and that was the limiting factor as well.
Thanks everyone for sharing. Okay, well, I will kind of clean up this agenda, and I'll save it, to our webpage so folks can reference it. And I will reach out to folks via email about this idea that was thrown out about making one agreement, and just let you know what role we can play in that. Great. Well, thank you everyone for your input today, and for sticking with this so long. And I guess stay tuned for future meetings. Our next meeting will probably have more of a more balanced agenda, different presenters and legislative updates, federal delegation staff. We'll likely be going back to that next.